Good afternoon. Welcome to our Institute for European Studies lecture series. This is the Halloween edition. Hopefully just for the cookies. I'm Patricia Young. I am the program manager of the Institute. And before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to mention our upcoming talk on Monday, November 4th. It's our last talk of the semester with Professor Anna Schwenk from University of Siegen in Germany. And the title of that talk is Flexible Authoritarianism, Cultivating Ambition and Loyalty in Russia. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Dagmar Soennecken. I hope that was the right pronunciation. From York University in Canada, who is speaking on selecting refugees for resettlement to Norway and Canada. Vulnerability, integration, and discretion. Dagmar Soennecken is an associate professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at York University in Toronto, Canada. She is also cross-appointed to the Law and Society program there. Her research focuses on comparative public policy in Europe and North America. She is particularly interested in questions concerning law and the courts, as well as citizenship and migration, including refugees. Professor Dagmar Soennecken holds a PhD in political science from University of Toronto. She has twice been a visiting scholar at the Center for European and International Alliance and Asylum Law at the University of Constance, Germany, as well as a visiting study fellow at the University of Oxford's Refugee Studies Center and a Canadian guest professor at the University of Kiel, Germany. Has also been a recurring visiting scholar at the Migration and Integration Studies Center and at the Jean Monnet Center for Excellence in European Studies in Osnabrück, Germany. In 2019, Dagmar became the editor-in-chief of Refuge, Canada's Journal of Refugees. Her work has been published in comparative migration studies, law and policy, droit and société, and politics and governance, among others. Professor Soennecken was one of the 3 Canadian co-investigators of the recently concluded VULNER project, and the full title of that is Vulnerabilities under the Global Protection Regime. This research study examines how protection seekers, migrants seeking legal protection status under national and international law, experience their vulnerabilities, and how these experiences are continuously shaped and produced in interaction with the legal and policy frameworks and implementation practices of the relevant decision makers. The project countries span the globe, including Europe, Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Norway, North America, Canada, the Middle East, Lebanon, and Africa, Uganda, and South Africa. The talk today is based on work published as a co-authored chapter in an open access volume called Between Protection and Harm, published by Springer. Professor Soennecken.
You might have to click on. Okay. Thank you very much for having me. Patricia and I have known each other for a long time, and it was such a pleasure to get the invitation to come to Cornell. And I must apologize from the beginning that I have a cold, so my voice may disappear or I might sneeze, but I hope you will bear with me and still find what I'm going to talk about interesting. Because as Patricia already mentioned, it's really funny timing sometimes when you give a talk, because the book that the chapter about looking at refugee resettlement in Norway and in Canada is in just came out like 2 weeks ago, and the publication date is 2025, because the physical books have not been printed yet, but it's completely open access because it's in an EMISCO, which is a particular migration series, and they've made it their mission to have all the e-copies available completely open access. So this is the promo for the book. So we're excited that it actually came out before the talk, and it was really just a funny coincidence that it just did. So that's my little promo. If this all goes by too fast, or you are more curious about some of the details that I'll be discussing, this is where you can find it. And as Patricia already mentioned, the research is part of an EU Horizon 2020 grant, and the Europeans at some point open up their granting system to Canadians. So it's really interesting because that really changes, I think, the conversation fundamentally. And the fancy topic that Patricia already mentioned, it's called vulnerabilities under the global protection regime. And the Europeans were very heavily focused on asylum, and the Canadians / North Americans were saying, if we talk about the concept of vulnerability, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, then we have to talk about other migrants as well. And with my lunch host, we were talking about the agricultural program that the law school has here. So in the Canadian context, there's also an agricultural farm workers, seasonal workers program, and there's a lot of vulnerability that migrants are experiencing or might carry with them. So the Canadians were trying to broaden the focus, but the Europeans were very much focused on refugees and asylum. So I will just talk a little bit about why this concept is contested, but is also seems to be, I put very hip, because I did not know when I became part of this team how increasingly in law and in policy, the term vulnerability keeps getting employed, sometimes as a contrast to resilience. But it's quite interesting just to think about what you think vulnerable means, if it's something that we carry in us or if it's something that's constructed, because that's something that the team was very much discussing in the context of how policymakers, because this is a grant that's aimed at making policy recommendations, how they should take vulnerability into account when making decisions about migration. I'll get to that in a little bit. But the particular case example is a comparison between Canada and Norway. And in the project, there were not that many countries that were focusing on refugee resettlement. And if you don't know what resettlement is, it's the humanitarian process by which certain countries around the world, and the United States obviously being the leading country, chooses refugees from overseas, mostly in refugee camps, and according to a certain system facilitated by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, then brings them to whatever country we're talking about, the US, Canada, and as you'll see, also Norway. There's a quota system. It gets complicated in terms of the details, but there is, in contrast to asylum law, no legal entitlement to be resettled as part of this process. Countries have quotas. It often makes them look particularly good, and the big criticism about resettlement is that only 1% of refugees out of all of the people that we count as forcibly displaced make it through this process. But it's still fascinating to look at, because the people that are already in encampment situations overseas and are there for a long time, we could argue are by definition vulnerable. So where does vulnerability then pop up in law and policy making? And that is what I'd like to talk to you about. And the challenge that my Norwegian colleague posed was that he was saying, well, aren't countries just cherry picking essentially? Because they pick certain people according to certain criteria and they didn't get saved and rescued, but it's called settlement. And that is, I think, the critique that I can also tell you a little bit more about, because the other two critiques that we discovered in the interviews that we made was that the resettlement process is supposed to be for people who can't find another solution, another home. But when they get resettled and they get chosen, how will these people then settle in? How will they integrate? As you will see in Canada, that's no longer an official criteria for picking people. In Norway, it still is with some qualifications. But should that play a role? Is that important if you're talking about people who really are in dangerous situations or perhaps need certain health requirements met? So that's also an ethical and really a normative question about what would you do, and should that play a role? And then how do countries actually decide whether that should play a role? And the other aspect I want to briefly talk to you about is that politicians like resettlement a lot, because it plays really well with certain audiences. If you're from a certain community and you hear that your president in Canada, the government, the prime minister, that in Norway, the government wants to take certain people from a certain country and offer them safety in your country, depending on if you already have people from that region, they might be more likely to vote for your party. It can also be something where you can just be seen as normatively the framing of seeing to bring people to protection and safety can be very good. But politicians also then play games with the categories and the quotas and the types of people that get moved and that don't get moved. And the people ultimately that are left behind, we found in the study in some interviews, are young single men. And the bureaucrats were often saying they get profiled, but in the opposite direction, because they're seen as the dangerous ones, as perhaps the radical ones. And ultimately then thinking about who's too vulnerable to be resettled, aren't we creating another problem? So that's also an ethical question, I think, but it's also a quantitative question. If you then are just picking women and children because they look like the vulnerable people to be resettled, that also seems fundamentally wrong. So there's lots of what countries actually do and then what we should be doing that is going on in the conversation, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that. Patricia already went over this, so this is just the bigger project. And no, the dots do not represent where all the countries were from, but it was really interesting in the project to have conversations between Europeans, a colleague who was studying Uganda and South Africa, then the team from Lebanon, and then the Canadian team to have conversations about, well, what do we think vulnerability means? And from Canada, we also had 4 different institutions with people from very different backgrounds. And there were a lot of lawyers, there were some anthropologists that were part of the team, and public policy people and political scientists. And for the bigger 28 people in 8 countries research grant to then come together under one theme and then to agree and discuss. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's stressful. What's interesting about this project is that it was only for 3 years. So if you're a student who wants to help out on some of these grants, it's a lot of intense transcription of interviews, and sometimes we only process the research findings afterwards. So a little bit about the research itself. So why do we care about vulnerability? There is a really interesting growing international interest in the concept. So there is something called the Global Compact for Migration that passed not that long ago at the international level. So the term came up there, and it seemed to come up in interviews and conversations with policymakers. So we in the project wanted to really dig more deeply into this. It seems to be appearing in law. It's defined differently at the national level and at the international level, what vulnerability really means. Then it seems to be really contested. Some people argue that there's this vulnerability contest. If you have more vulnerability markers, then you get more protection, you get status quicker, or you get resettled more quickly. So that is problematic. But really then what do also migrants themselves think about vulnerability? That was also something that we wanted to include in the project. But then we also wanted to do some comparisons about people who were labeled as vulnerable, how the different countries then deal with those migrants. Again, do they just get procedural accommodations? In Canada, it was quite common that the order of questioning in a refugee hearing was reversed, or that somebody didn't have to prove something, so there were procedural changes. But this was also something that we wanted to dig more deeply into. If you are labeled as vulnerable by somebody, what is the process? What do they think? Who gets labeled? And how does that labeling then change the outcome? And then again, what would we recommend to those policymakers? That's mainly the European policymakers, but we've had a great interest and uptake at the Canadian level as well. And we've had Canadian policymakers in a roundtable workshop, and it was really interesting to also get their responses. So the research was academic, but then also trying to dig into some of the details. So a little bit about the concept vulnerability, because at lunch I was talking with somebody about how it really is a contrast to the term resilience. That's also, if you are interested in refugees and forced migration studies, there's a lot of talk about how important it is to be resilient. But if somebody has some of these personal markers, so this is just splitting it up a little bit to give you an idea of what you think vulnerability is. And it can be created by the situation you're in. It can be something that's innate to you, that's not changeable. It can be something that's induced. So trauma would be a good example. It's really the opposite of self-reliance, and it can apply to certain groups of people, or it could just exist at the individual level. And then depending on how policymakers and governments define this term, again, there is a tension there. You could make yourself more vulnerable. Sometimes people do stupid things, and this happens as part of the journey, or you just, if you're thinking about people trekking to the US through the Darien Gap, there is a constant risk and something might happen along there. So it's really a complicated concept. And interestingly enough, refugee support organizations also don't like this term because they think people really lack agency. It makes them look like victims that don't have any self-control and self-determination. So it really is a concept. Aside from this, there might be a competition of who has more of these markers, how we define it. There's a big literature to dig into. In the chapter, we talk a little bit about some of the critique, and the entire book also gets into this. Because again, if you then talk to policymakers, they often don't have a fancy definition. Academics talk about it a lot, but for policymakers, it was very much what you see is what you get. But in terms of the overall refugee resettlement process, I just explained this at the beginning, but just as a reminder that in general, if you're imagining people waiting overseas and they've left their home and their safety, we would argue that they are all vulnerable, but then you're picking certain people, and that's what the UN process is doing, the most vulnerable people according to certain categories, and they're listed in the UNHCR. It's called the Resettlement Handbook. These handbooks get constructed with countries that are willing to take people, and that's where the categories and the quotas are found of who is considered most vulnerable. It's interesting to note that the categories have really evolved over time, so they're not natural. And my students always love we're labeling people and categories are normal, but categories shift. And from 1988 on, because there was more conflict in Africa, that's where some handbooks started to include references to survivors of torture, gender-based violence, and those individuals had not previously been resettled as much because they were not explicitly mentioned in the category. So that's just an example of why categories and the people, the policymakers that make these categories are really important. And then again, a reminder that refugee resettlement is really 1% of the overall population. So we're talking about a really small category, but it's politically very popular. And since I'm in the United States, I, as a Canadian, then have to say the United States, despite a bump under the last Trump administration, tends to be the country that resettles the most individuals. So that's why I'm not sure if you can see the numbers, but the US, this is up to 2018, because after that, the US went down and Canada actually became the top country, but the US really dwarfs everybody else. So in the comparison with Canada and Norway that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail, we're talking about the second tier countries, but Canada still is fairly big. And Sweden is actually also an interesting case. So the Scandinavian countries are interesting to look at. But this is also the contrast between where people are coming from, where they are getting resettled from, and where the countries are that are interested in resettling people. So Europe, there is a little bit more going on. More recently, Germany has been experimenting with this a little bit, but it's really the classic immigration countries that do resettle refugees.
So would you call it resettled people is what in the US would be called asylum recipients? Is that what we're talking about?
Okay. There are two different ways in which people can get international protection. They can arrive And that's what many countries are trying to stop people from, arrive at the border of a country without this prior invitation process. And those we often call refugee claimants or asylum seekers. So all the stuff that you see in the media, especially in the US, of people arriving at the Mexico-US border, those people have not been invited according to this categorization quota system. So they are refugees and asylum seekers. We call them inland claims often because people show up at the border. That's also the story in Europe where you see people dying in the Mediterranean, all the Syrians that were trying to make their way through Europe because countries then have an international obligation, and that's the 1951 Geneva Convention. So under the Geneva Convention, the countries that have signed that have an obligation to provide safety against persecution. So that is the definition of offering refugee status, but there's a process behind that. But this is the complete opposite. This is the humanitarian, oh, we want to feel good. So therefore we pick people from overseas and then we offer and invite them protection. But those people in many countries meet the same definition or must meet the definition of who a refugee is before they get selected to go overseas. But it's an excellent question because I was bracketing the people that come uninvited, because actually in the US very often this is the less politically controversial subject because the people already meet the status. They are refugees according to the Geneva Convention, and then they get invited to come. So all the paperwork is done overseas, the security screening is done over there, and then they come. And then we could talk, if we had time, about integration and such. But the people that you see in the news media that just arrive at the border, they're still wanting to go for that process, but they've made their way uninvited already that far, because there's an international norm that says you should be checking to see if this person needs international protection. But a little bit about Canada and Norway and why you as Americans should care. Again, they are the countries that are also interested in keen in resettlement. Canada, your neighbor to the north, is a little bit smaller, so it's the size of California. It has since the 1970s offered resettlement through two different streams. The government has invited refugees to come to Canada. And then since the Indochina Vietnam conflict, Canada created what's often called private or community sponsorships, where organizations at the local level say that they are willing to sponsor a refugee or a group of refugees. That could be churches, that could be community organizations. So that's the so-called community or PSR, private sponsorship stream. So that's the thing that has made Canada well known on this front. And humanitarianism and also being involved at the UN and playing a central role there, even though Canada and Norway are both smaller players internationally, that is very much important to Canada's national identity. It's also so-called settler society, so an immigration society, and it plans annually, as does Norway, as does the US actually, in terms of the number of targets as an immigration country, how many people should we take? And I have some of these numbers, but the Canadians are always proud that they were the top country in 2019 for political reasons, because that's when the US dialed back how many people they were willing to take. Now, why should you care about Norway? If you're interested in comparative politics, it's really interesting because Norway had this big transition in the 1960s. They used to be an emigration country, so a country that was sending people overseas, and they were losing people, but then things turned around because Norway is an oil state. And eventually they also became part of what's called the EU plus region. So they're not an EU member state, but there is a relationship and a tie with the European Union where they follow a lot of the policies and get some of the benefits that EU member states do. Humanitarianism and UN involvement is also really important to them. And my Norwegian colleague would say now, and they pay more money to the UN than Canada does. And they also do something, they don't earmark where the money should go. Norway actually says, okay, you can have the money, but you decide, United Nations, what you want to spend the money on. About the Norwegian case, Norway has what's called government-led resettlement. So the government, in collaboration with UNHCR, decides who and how many come to Norway annually. The Norwegian numbers has been kind of fairly steady around 3,000, but since there are only around 5.5 million people in Norway, that still makes them per capita really important resettlement country. They have some interesting, quirky, smaller resettlements. So PEN, the Writers Association, and then there's an association of cities that's called ICORN. So they also choose to resettle individuals. But Erland, one of my two co-authors would say, but we're really only talking about 1 or 2 people because they get specifically profiled and picked out. But it is still interesting that the government is involved, and then there are some exceptions. More recently, Norway has been discussing, as have other European countries, to introduce the Canadian model. And it's explicitly referenced as such, to have a community/private sponsorship stream, because the research has found that people that come through the support of that local community often integrate and do better after they arrive. In Canada, you also get a different amount of money for different lengths of time. But the important thing is that the community knows this person is coming. They help them with their settlement, their integration, their arrival. So that really is something that's being discussed in Norway at the moment, but officially is not on the books. Okay, so then what were we doing? What were our methods in comparing Canada and Norway? And why, again, is this something that you should really care about? If you remember, I said at the beginning that there was a lot of cherry picking going on. There was also in the interviews that we did, and we did a lot of interviews for all of the countries. Sometimes it varied a bit. The Norwegians, for example, talked to people at the municipal level, and they also did participant observation, which we didn't do in Canada. We talked to refugee lawyers. So there's a little bit of variation in terms of where some of the interview data is coming from. But in the interviews, there was always this business about integration and somebody's integration potential coming up, even though we were discussing vulnerability and how to really pick people and what the interviewee themselves understood vulnerability to mean in the migration context. And the other interesting finding that I briefly wanted to talk about were the examples that were getting mentioned were often the high-profile political examples. The controversial ones were governments were highlighting. For example, Yazidi refugee women were both in Canada and the United States, Christian refugees in a Muslim context that were highlighted politically very much. So just to give you a little bit more detail on the integration potential and on the political tactics, I have a little bit more examples. But what's also really interesting about resettlement, if you are a budding law student and perhaps you want to go into this direction, is that in contrast to the inland process that Patricia was asking about, there is no appeal option for people who are resettled from overseas, because UNHCR and the Canadian, the Norwegian, the American staff make the decisions, and depending on who you are and what category you're in, you can't appeal the decision. So it's highly discretionary who gets resettled. It's also highly discretionary if you talk to individual decision makers overseas who they see as vulnerable, even though they have a handbook and they have guidelines. So some interviewees were saying, oh, I know, that's a person who's vulnerable. And we were saying, but what category did they fit in? Oh, they were clearly vulnerable. But what does that then mean if there's no transparency and we don't understand your process and there is no appeal? So that's also something from the law and policy perspective that is problematic but typical for overseas assessments. I think it's really interesting that Canada got rid of and tried to be super progressive of a so-called self-sufficiency requirement. So if you're picking people who are in a camp, who have been maybe traumatized, who have been persecuted, and they're waiting for safety and a new home. And you're still, this is where we're getting at the cherry picking business, you're still saying, who might do better? Who has the educational skills, the right backgrounds, and who would do best in Canada, in Norway? Canada used to have this requirement formally in law until 2001, but then it decided, because it got criticized so extensively, it decided to no longer have the self-sufficiency requirement apply, even though, interestingly, it is still there in law. So they're not using it, but it still is around in legislation. So one never knows whether it could be activated again. But the other thing that Canada did was that, remember I talked about all these categories? So Canada started to create new categories for people that they thought were vulnerable, and then the procedure and the timeline by which they got invited to come to Canada changed. So Canada was one of the first countries that piloted a so-called Women at Risk project, because bureaucrats saw that women were never picked in this self-sufficiency assessment. So that's why there was a Women at Risk program. Then since 1979, there's been a program for people with high medical needs. That's used to be called special needs cases. It's now called the Joint Assistance Sponsorship Stream, because communities support it and governments support the program and the individuals that are coming. Then there's also another fancy sounding title, the Blended Visa Officer Referred Cases, where somebody is identified as somebody who urgently needs to move, perhaps because there's a death threat. And some of the markers, for example, if you're an LGBTQI person and you are in an area where that might get you killed, but the numbers for some of these projects are very small. But again, in terms of innovation on vulnerability and resettlement, there seems to be this push-pull between, okay, we're doing something, and then until 2001, which I know for you guys is ancient history, but the fact that this thing is still on the books is what is really interesting. And in the Canadian context, because Canada is so well known for the involvement of communities in resettlement, so if the government is not involved, but communities nominate individuals, and this process is called naming. They name the family that they want to support, which is what makes this so innovative and what makes people do so well. But if you're thinking about vulnerability, then it's up to the community to say, well, do we want somebody who's vulnerable? Because the government does not look at these vulnerability criteria that I mentioned before. They just look at whether the community support is there. So Canada has recently been increasing the number of people that come through the community stream and not letting the government-sponsored stream grow very much. So the criticism is that we have a privatization of refugee resettlement. But if you care about vulnerable migrants, these people are usually, they speak the language better, have a better educational background, and so more vulnerable people might be left behind just by the way that the government is playing with the numbers of people that are coming. This is just, if you're curious, how the different categories break down. The left bar, and these numbers are from 2019 when we were doing some of the research before and after COVID. So the privately sponsored refugees have been steadily growing, and the government ones, those are the three bars on the right. So this is just so that you can see that they used to be kind of equal, and now the private one is slowly growing. So what's really interesting about the Norwegian case is that Norway is still kind of in the pre-Canada, pre-2001 period, in that they, until 2020, used to have very explicit integration criteria, to the extent that they were checking somebody's educational and vocational competences as they would fit the Norwegian labor market. So it was really a narrow look as, can this person really make it in Norway? But then the problem was that Norway also ended up with really young refugees and was really open to taking families. And then these criteria about the labor market didn't really work, because if somebody was too young and didn't have educational and vocational experience, then what are you going to do? So in law, they had this really tough criteria, but in practice, they weren't really using it, because the people they were resettling just did not fit this criteria. But it looked good for the government to have the explicit, we're looking for people that really fit the labor market in it. The current practice is that there is a more vague reference to the integration potential of the individual, because now the Norwegian government, the immigration ministries check with the individual municipalities, and they get feedback whether there's integration capacity at the municipal level. And I put capacity in quotation marks because that's still code for, well, do we have the money? Do we have the people to support this individual? And that's, of course, also the way that perhaps it should be done, because you don't want to take somebody and then you cannot provide the trauma care or the health care that the person needs. But this really also could be a code word for this person is too expensive, and really we don't want them for all kinds of other reasons. But that's the current practice. And the view of what integration means is still very much focused on, can this person work and make a contribution to our economy? And there's much different ways in which we could talk about defining integration. So that's also something to think about. Then just a couple of examples about this business about politicians. And I know the US has a similar game, how politicians in both Canada and Norway were playing political games with refugee resettlement. And this is just a definitional thing for you. If you ever take a course in forced migration studies, there is this thing called the strategic use of resettlement, which is really about if you resettle refugees, your society might get other kinds of benefits. This is not what I'm talking about when we talk about the political or tactical uses of resettlement. It is really, you resettle people because your voters might like this, or because your country might like the symbolic messaging of you taking a few token tortured women from country X. This is what I'm talking about, not about the definition. This was just in case there were nerds in the room who thought I might mean this, but this is what I'm talking about. So the examples. Canada had a conservative government until 2015. 2015 was the election where the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who is now on his third term and who will likely lose the next election when he came in. But this election was very much around the time of the Syrian refugee crisis. And what was interesting was that the Prime Minister at the time, Harper, was very reluctant to take any Syrian refugees, which is not, I think, unfamiliar to an American audience. And there was a lot of anti-Muslim coded messaging. But then the Prime Minister was pressed why all of a sudden the screening for refugees in the resettlement process had been halted. And then reporters found out that behind the scenes, the staffers of the Prime Minister were checking to make sure that the people, there are not that many files, right? So you saw the numbers, that the people had ties to existing groups in the community where votes for the Conservative Party in the next election might come from. So there was, the Prime Minister denied this with the words that they were only selecting the most vulnerable. And if that happened to be Christian communities and not Muslim communities, because that was also the problem, that it seemed like files from Shia and Sunni Muslim families were being explicitly denied status. The Christian refugee files were being advanced because they were more popular. Politicians, I'm sure, do this stuff all the time. This initially changed when the new Prime Minister came into office because they promised to resettle 25,000 refugees, which for Canada was a really big number. And you could invite somebody else to give a talk about how that went. But what is interesting is that the Liberal government, even though they sounded much better, they were still introducing programs, for example, for Yazidi women who also showed up in Norway. So they were also playing some of these political games, but the whole halting the process behind the scenes and making sure that the voters were really liking who was being resettled, that's, I think, we thought was on another level. This came up as one of the examples of how resettlement gets politically played with in the Canadian context. In the Norwegian context, there was something quite similar with the same communities that happened in 2020. And that is that as in Canada, I did spell that right. I thought I wrote as in Canada, but we are talking about Norway. So three specific religious minorities, one of them the Yazidis that I already mentioned, but the controversy was similar but different in that the Norwegian government had announced that it would take Christian minority refugees from Iran, Iraq, Syria, Ahmadiyas, and Yazidi, but that they would take over all of the 3,000 spots that Norway had in that particular year. And there had already been people that had been selected, so that was part of the controversy. Then there were some prominent UN officials that spoke out and said, if you take that many people from that region, you're going to destabilize that community. That might be a problem for the way that that community is developing, so don't do that. And then it was also extensively covered in the Norwegian media, and there was talk about Islamophobia. Although Norway, like Canada, is a predominantly Christian society, it was clear that there were some voters that thought that this was cherry picking because these people look good, and similar rationale as in Canada. Then as the policy had been passed in the Norwegian government to go ahead and do this, there was an election, and then the subsequent Norwegian government then reversed the policy and went back to the typical, we're not going to be just picking some people because it makes us look better. But the overall message is that it's really easy to designate some people as vulnerable and then still continue this othering process that I think many of us who want less restriction and more open discussion amongst groups would like to see. So it is also an example in a country like Norway where this could happen as well. Then I just wanted to bring a couple of quotes, as I said at the beginning, something that you might want to think about, because I'm getting slowly to the end of this, is that if you're thinking that you would be the policymaker in charge, who do you think you would pick, and what process do you would you pick? And one of the bureaucrats who we asked said that it's really tough. And we have so many people that are vulnerable. We have to categorize, because how else are we going to do it? And this is then where we got to the example where he said, but if you look at, in particular, young men in Syria, who the Canadian government at that time had said, well, there might be security risks. We're going to prioritize women and children, and then we're going to deal with the men because we have to do our security clearance. So the interviewee was saying, but we know that there are definitely men who need significant additional support and who are risks, who are significantly at risk for mental health concerns and for risk of self-harm. And many of them would have been experiencing sexual violence. And we really have this gendered lens by which we are looking at what vulnerable is. And that might then leave young men as the people who are really left behind. And that then can create all kinds of other problems. So it seems if you're thinking about vulnerability and the power of countries, mainly in the global north, to invite people from conflict zones and close to conflict zones, so from those refugee camps to come to North America, Australia, and also in our case, Norway, there's this odd balancing act. There is this pragmatism of, well, we have to be able to pay for the healthcare, the social support, the trauma services. But at the same time, do we really want to go all on the integration potential, vocational criteria, labor market? I think both Canada and Norway are saying that's too much. We need to have a more holistic understanding of what integration really is. And politicians will always play games with communities because the symbolic mention and the voter appeal will always be there. But really, what's the best strategy for a long-term sustainability of this program? That's also been struggling because countries are reluctant to take newcomers, Because again, they think that they would be a drain on the system, on the welfare system. They might be too expensive. They might not learn the language and so on and so forth. So what really is the best step forward? And especially since the numbers of those individuals are very small. So some government officials think we really need to protect that program and let the countries pick who they want to pick and not somebody who might come and who might be really expensive. But UNHCR, and then I'm done, UNHCR has really pushed back and just said it really is a discriminatory practice to use something like integration or other selection criteria, because some countries look at the size of your family, how old you are, whether and what health conditions you have, what your religion, what your ethnicity is. So any of these kinds of criteria should not matter, because really people should be allowed a chance to live in safety. And so that's also endorsed in UNHCR's policies. But again, the reality of it is quite different, and it is just something to investigate and look at if you were in charge to make recommendations. This is just in case you're interested. This is the Canadian team. I don't have a slide for the Norwegian team because Erland, my colleague, didn't give this to me. And I'm sure the slides will also be hopefully visible in the recording. But we had a lot of community partners who we were interviewing, and also we're very fortunate to have people who were migrants speak to us directly, and that was also really fascinating to hear that. Thank you.